All right, we are at the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar, Records Preservation. Do you need it? We appreciate you joining us today, and the first thing I always like to do is just take a second and introduce our speakers. My name is Shayna Horka, and I work in product marketing here at Gimmal. And I'm joined by our key speaker today, Gimmal product owner, Will Irwin.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Will Irwin. I'm a product owner at Gimmal based out of Houston, Texas, and thanks for joining the webinar today.
Well, and before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items to go through. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen. We're going to answer as many as we have time for at the end of the presentation. There will also be at least one poll question that you'll see pop up in a separate screen, so please keep an eye out for that. All answers are anonymous. And as always, if you have any technical difficulties, please let us know so we can assist you. So to kick things off, I have just a few slides here to tell you a little bit about Gimmal and how we can help you take control of your information with our suite of software solutions. Gimmal is an information governance software company founded in 2002. Our mission is to help you achieve your information governance goals by providing solutions that help you balance the value your information provides with the risk it also presents. Whether you're trying to discover information in unstructured data sources, migrate from legacy systems, or comply with policies across multiple repositories, Gimmal can help you achieve your information governance goals. We have a client success team and a global network of partners that deliver solutions in conjunction with key partners like Microsoft and SAP. Gimmal's family of software products work together to let you create an efficient digital workplace. Our comprehensive solutions include migrations from legacy systems, file analysis and e-discovery, electronic and physical records management, and document management for SAP content. Now we're going to go ahead and dive right in with one of those poll questions that I had mentioned earlier. Before we get started, I just kind of want to set a baseline to those who have maybe considered preservation copies in their 2022 records management strategy. You should see a poll question pop up on your screen. The answers are yes, no, or maybe you're unsure.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for your responses on this. This preservation concept, it's relatively new, so we're a bit interested to see who has been thinking about this about the strategy.
Great, so you should see the answers on the screen. Will, do you see them?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so pretty evenly spread, but awesome. And that'll give Will a good idea of how to tailor today's conversation.
Yeah, that's
but
good.
With that, we'll go ahead and move into the meat of the presentation.
All right, thank you, Shayna. Today we are mainly discussing preservation copies, what it is and how it differs from the traditional method of locking content in place, also known as immutable records. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Shayna. And we'll start with defining immutable records, which should be a familiar concept to everyone here today. Basically, an immutable record in the digital world is content, a document or file that has been declared a record at some point in its life cycle, or if that content has been placed on a legal hold. Typically, when that happens, when a record is declared or a legal hold is applied, the records management system will place a lock on that content, not allowing end users the ability to delete or further modify the content or its metadata properties. The record would remain locked throughout the remainder of its retention period through to its official disposition, unless specifically unlocked by a record manager. And we have a definition here from IGI Global that does a pretty good job explaining immutable records. An immutable record object is one whose state cannot be modified after it is created, except through a consensus mechanism involving other participants, which is important. We'll touch a bit on this in the next slide. This implies that records cannot be altered or deleted once it has been created unless consensus is achieved, again with the consensus here. And let's go ahead and jump to the next slide here, Shana. So next we'll dive into a bit of the pros and cons, the positives and limitations of traditional immutable records. So some of the positives here include typically a padlock icon or something similar is visualized right next to the digital record in its respective repository. This gives records managers a bit of peace of mind, knowing that the original record is immutable. It's not editable for changes or deletion by end users. And users can still see the document and view its content and metadata for reference, but are really unable to make any updates or delete the document because it's essentially locked down. And immutable records that are locked also indicate to end users that the document they are viewing, referencing, or were working on is deemed an official record by their organization. And this insight helps end users understand the records management process and can be helpful to organizations and records management teams who may require this knowledge from their end users. And some immutable records limitations include the fact that since the record is now locked down, it's no longer available for editing, meaning that the end users who may have been using and working on that document no longer have the ability to do so. Record managers may be requested to manually lift that lock in order for end users to continue their work, which may impact the official lifecycle and retention of the record and may go against organizational records management policy. So really consensus between end users and records managers will need to be met to fulfill these requests, not if, but when they happen. And depending on the records management system and the processes in place, this unlock request, it can take time to complete and could hinder the working flow of all parties involved. Another potential downside of immutable records is that depending on organizational policies and communication, end users will start to become aware that at some point the documents that they are creating and working on will become locked down, which may cause those end users to potentially go against official policy. They may create, work, and save this content outside of the records repository just to avoid that content from being locked when it's eventually declared a record. And this could cause a domino effect where potential records remain unclassified and undiscoverable, which could lead to some serious compliance and e-discovery issues if left unmitigated. And legal holds present another potential problem. If a legal hold is applied, records will be locked in place, and legal teams may not want users to know that records were being placed on legal hold, essentially blocking from continuing their life cycle while on the hold. You can go ahead and go to the next slide here, Shana. Which brings us to preservation copies. And I realize now that some people may be getting this confused with the preservation of physical records. So maybe really old physical records of folders and files that may be deteriorating that you may look to scan or digitize for further preservation of that physical record content. Now that's an important topic that we may address in a future webinar, but that's really not what we're talking about here today. Now, a preservation copy, it's a bit different. A preservation copy, it's a versioned copy of a record that is created when the original record content or metadata is updated or altered in any way. Preservation copies are usually stored separately from the original record and can be viewed, to see the record content and metadata for any given point in time during its life cycle. And end users are able to continue working and editing the document, and depending on the configuration settings being used, it will create and save, it will preserve each version of that record. So essentially, preservation copies ensure that changes to the records are preserved and accounted for, and end users can still work on their documents without being worried that it will be locked down. The preservation copies will exist indefinitely separate from the original record until the original record is officially disposed of by a records manager based on whatever lifecycle rules it had placed on it originally. And we have a decent definition of preservation copies, which states that a preservation copy is a version of a thing set aside to protect its information content from harm, injury, decay, or destruction. And I would include here also to really protect its information content from being lost due to modifications from end users. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide here, Shanna. So again, the record preservation that we are talking about now, it's for digital content. It is a one-to-one version copy of the content and metadata of the original record that is being managed. Preservation copies are created each time the original record content or metadata is modified, or if the original record is manually deleted by an end user, maybe outside of the official records management process. So this ensures that a kind of content audit history is retained for changes that may happen to managed records. And some of the positives of records preservation include the end user's ability to, again, continue working on the document at their leisure. So like we mentioned at the beginning, preservation does not lock down the record content. So users can create and modify and even delete the documents at will without worry. And they do not need to worry about their document getting locked down, maybe in their eyes a bit prematurely. Nor do they need to worry about getting scolded at by maybe an angry records manager, because everything record related, it's still accounted for. So from the records manager perspective, preservation copies of the original record are retained and available to view and restore if needed, and will still adhere to the official lifecycle and records retention schedule. And the primary, I guess, limitation of record preservation, it's a bit different than the traditional immutable records management that people are mostly used to today. Usually with preservation, end users won't see a padlock or similar icon appear next to the record in its content repository, indicating that it has been declared a record. So the record's importance could be lost to end users who may be looking for that visual representation, but honestly, that's a bit more of a positive in my mind. And traditional records managers may have a difficult time moving away from the tried and true approach to locking records, because that's just what they're used to and most familiar with. So this, however, should not deter organizations from implementing and enabling creation of preservation copies, because it can really help mitigate key ongoing issues that end users and records managers face, as well as setting up your organization for future success. You can jump to the next slide here, Shanna. So which is better, immutable records or preservation copies? Well, that really depends. So both methods are effective records management strategies that succeed in accomplishing their primary goal and ensuring that records are kept in a certain state and discoverable for compliance, litigation, and organizational needs throughout their intended life cycle, and eventually disposed of properly. Choosing one over the other, it's really an organization preference. luckily, most sophisticated records management systems like Gimmal Records have both options available to choose from, and the main decision that needs to be made is when and where to implement which method. You can go ahead to the next slide here, Shana. And most of the decision making is made when realizing how this impacts the end users. Like we mentioned before, immutable records could interfere with the end user's working flow. So locking the document content, which could hinder their ability to continue their work. And this is really where preservation copies, in my mind, it's really where it shines. So enabling preservation for managed records does not impact the end users at all. So users are free to continue working and editing the document. So no more requests to record managers to unlock something that may have still been in progress from the end user's perspective. And end users may never even realize that their document, that they're working on is being actively managed, because preservation copy creation, it's all happening behind the scenes. And records managers are also happy to get fewer requests, knowing that all changes that are happening to that record are being preserved and can be restored or discovered if needed for litigation purposes or really for any other reason. So really it's a win-win across the board for all parties involved, and why I'm a huge advocate for enabling record preservation. Next slide here, Shana. And if you decide that preservation is something that your organization needs, Gimmal is pleased to announce the addition of preservation capabilities for our Gimmal records management product through our new Microsoft 365 SharePoint connector. Released just last week, Gimmal's Microsoft 365 SharePoint connector manages content in SharePoint Online and provides support for preservation copies. Next slide here, Shana. So what is it? The Microsoft 365 SharePoint connector, it integrates with Gimmal Records SaaS and SharePoint Online to create, store, and manage preservation copy records in Azure Blob Storage. The M365 SharePoint connector, it's hosted in the Gimmal cloud, so no need to install and implement or manage an on-premise solution. It's all available there, hosted by us in our cloud. And this first release, it's really only focused on SharePoint Online, but this capability will soon be added to our other supported data sources. And again, this does support preservation capabilities to create and manage preservation copy records. If you can hit the next slide here, Shana. So Gimmal preservation copies is it's a copy of the record being managed by Gimmal Records using our new M365 SharePoint connector that is preserved in the cloud in Azure storage. They are created by placing a copy of the content and its metadata into an Azure storage account managed by your organization. So it's a bring your own storage approach where you own and manage the cloud storage, and we connect to it for a reduced cost. And you can feel secure knowing that your preservation copy records are housed within your own organization. And if you're familiar with Gimmal records, record classes can have preservations enabled with the following options here. You've got new versions, which preserve all new versions of a document, as well as the current version. And then your second option here is all versions, which preserve all previous versions and all new versions of a document. Legal holds will also automatically create a new preservation copy for every version of a document after it has been placed on legal hold. And again, a little bit more about this initial release of preservation will focus on SharePoint Online, and the rules of preservation are based on the SharePoint version settings configured for a document library in which these documents or these records reside. So, if you're familiar with SharePoint versioning, you've got major only, or you've got major and minor versions will be retained as a preservation copy, depending on that library's configuration. And in future releases here, they will have different rules to work best with the given data source. And again, a little bit more about preservation copies. They are then retained. Whenever they're created, they're retained within each customer's Azure Blob Storage account, and they will persist out there indefinitely until the original record is officially disposed and or the legal case is closed. So even if the original record is manually deleted, right, from SharePoint Online, either deleted accidentally by an end user or removed intentionally from the repository, its preservation copy is a copy of that original record. It will still exist in the Azure storage account throughout that life cycle, as indicated by the records retention schedule and lifecycle rules that you've configured within your file plan and Gimmal records. It's pretty cool stuff. And I think we've got another poll question here on the next slide, Shanna. Would you like to?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, thanks, Will. So this was really a bit of an education session. Also, we're really excited to announce the release of preservation copies. We didn't do a deep dive into our capabilities with preservation copies. We probably will be doing a webinar in the future showing it. But if you'd like more information now as you plan your 2022 records management strategy, go ahead and hit yes on that poll that you should see pop up. We can give you a demonstration, talk to Will about just a little bit more of the details of preservation copies. So while that's going, Will, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the Q&A. We have quite a bit of questions.
Okay.
If you can't think of any questions right now, but you think of any later, both of our email addresses are right there on the screen. So please take note of that, and then feel free to email us at any point after the webinar. So the first question we have is, what evidence exists with preservation copies to indicate that our records have been managed properly according to schedules? And if I'm not mistaken, I believe this might have to do with the immutable record slide that you were talking about, Will, where you could see the lock.
Sorry, Shannon, can you say that question
absolutely.
one more time?
What evidence exists with preservation copies to indicate that our records have been managed properly according to schedules?
Because you'll still see that original record entry within Gimmal records. So just because the original record may have been removed from the repository, if preservation is enabled, you will still see that record entry appear within the Gimmal Records Manager web, and you'll still and you'll see that if it has preservation copies created for it, you'll see that indicated within that entry in Gimmal records, which also highlights what lifecycle and what retention policy is currently being managed for that item. So just because it's might have been deleted in the repository, you'll still see it in Gimmal records with a link to that preservation copy information out in Azure Blob Storage. So all of that should still be available to view from that angle, and you can kind of have peace of mind knowing that it's still following according to plan.
Great, and I think you answered this question. I'm pretty sure it came in before you answered it, though. But just so we can get it again, are preservation copies ever modified to reflect changes made by end users? Would you just create different preservation versions?
Exactly, that's a good question. So once a preservation copy is created, that is there is no modifying that preservation copy. It is a point in time for if the record content was modified or the metadata was modified, it captures that moment in time and preserves it out in Azure storage. And then once that is created, there are no more modifications that happen to it. So if you ever needed to go back and see what that record looked like at that given point in time, you could definitely do so knowing that no other changes have happened to that preservation copy in particular. So if, let's say that another modification was made on that original record, then you're exactly right. I think that's what this question was alluding to. Another preservation copy version of that original record would get created out in Azure storage. So basically, it's really a content audit of everything that ever happens to that original record. We capture it in that point in time and we store it so that you can easily go back and see, hey, what did that record look like in this time? We've got it captured. We know exactly what happened.
Great. And the next one is you said that other products, oh, hold on, let me see. You said it will be added to other products. Is there a timeline for the addition of preservation copies to Gimmal records for SharePoint on premises?
For SharePoint on premises, not at this time. I know the next one that we are currently working on is for the Documentum connector. So we're going to add preservation capabilities to our Documentum connector next. And then I think down the road, maybe right after that, SharePoint on-prem might be up for consideration. But for right now, that's not the next thing that we're working on.
Great. The next question we have is side-by-side comparison available to see changes in records? For example, deletion, addition, modification, like redlining, and etc.
You can, yes, you can see in the Azure storage account, you can see the preservation copies there, and then you can view them and open them side by side to see what changes have occurred. I don't think at this time there's anything like in the title of the document that shows, oh, this was a modification or, oh, this was a deletion. But you can certainly see what changes have happened to that content or the metadata side by side.
Great. Can Gimmal records use both immutable records and preservation copies for different record classes? For example, some record classes are immutable and other record classes have preservation copies.
Exactly. Yes. Some record classes can be strictly for preservation copies. You can have another record class that with a life cycle that does traditional record declaration through immutable records. And you can also combine the two. I've even seen some use cases to where you have preservation enabled on a record class that also at some point in its life cycle gets locked down. So you can use them separately, you can use them together, or you can use one or the other. I've seen any and all use cases.
Great. And then can you use the Microsoft 365 SharePoint connector at the same time as we're using our existing SharePoint Online connector?
So no, and that's a good question. So running both connectors at the same time is not currently supported, and really there's no reason to. So if you are interested in preservation copy functionality, then you need to move to the new M365 SharePoint connector. And with the M365 SharePoint connector, we do also provide the ability to lock files from being deleted. But this time by applying M365 retention labels to the items in SharePoint Online. And we will probably have another webinar in the future that talks a bit more about this functionality and behavior.
Great. And then I'm going to ask one more. I know we have a lot of questions come in. If you didn't get your question answered, we're going to email you after the webinar. I just want to be respectful of time. We have about a minute left. So the last question I'll ask is, what happens if a document is reclassified from one record class that has preservation to a record class that does not have preservation turned on?
So that's another good question. So we have all of this information covered in our online documentation, which describes certain scenarios and expected preservation copy behavior. So for this use case in particular, if I heard it right, I would expect the previously created preservation copies to persist in Azure storage and be retained throughout the rest of the original record's lifecycle. And then if it moves to a record class that doesn't have preservation copies enabled, then no new preservation copies will be created because the new record class that the record belongs to doesn't have it enabled.
Great. So that wraps up our Q&A. Again, if you can think of any other questions, if our names are too hard to remember, you can always email us at info@gimmal.com and we'll make sure your question gets to the right person. You can also visit our website at www.gimmal.com. For those interested in the recording of today's webinar, we will be sending it out between 24 and 48 hours in the form of a thank you email. So please check that email for the recording if you're looking for it. We want to thank you for joining today's webinar. We hope you have a great rest of your day. And on behalf of our entire company, wish you a wonderful holiday season. Thank you.